A listener's note. The following episode contains coarse language, adult themes, and content of a violent and disturbing nature, and may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
You would think that going to a concert would be a safe thing for everyone. First, you have thousands of like-minded people looking to have a good time. No one sets out to ruin the evening for everyone else. You paid good money for your tickets, and you've waited a long time for this night to come. Second, there is security everywhere. The last thing an artist, a promoter, or a venue wants is there to be some kind of trouble where someone gets hurt, or worse. For 99.999% of all concerts, things run smoothly. Yeah, someone might get a little drunk or stoned and cause trouble. And maybe a fight breaks out because someone got pushed. But generally, these common issues are dealt with quickly and without any serious repercussions or drama. In other words, concerts, for the most part, are safe spaces. Except when they're not. Concerts are easy pickings for anyone who wants to cause carnage. They are mass gatherings, and such concentrations of unsuspecting people are easy, soft targets for people determined to cause injury and death. If you look at things on a global scale, concerts are more often the target of terrorism than you may realize. The Global Terrorism Database did a study of attacks on concerts and festivals going back to 1970, and they found 146 examples. Most targets were religious festivals with 54, but in second place were concerts with 29. The most common type of attack was bombing, followed by assaults, which included firearms. Most victims were on site when it happened. Between 1970 and 2019, 244 people were killed at concerts and festivals, and 1,656 were injured. Those numbers have gone up substantially since that study concluded. They do not, for example, include the deaths and casualties in the Hamas attack on the Supernova Festival in Israel on October 7, 2023. At least 346 people died that day. And if it seems that there have been more terrorist attacks on concerts and festivals, you're not imagining things. There was a spike starting in 2015 that continued until the COVID lockdown in 2020. I have details on 2 terrorist attacks that happened during that period. The first was on a seemingly normal Friday night in Paris, and the other was late on a Monday evening when everyone was going home. I'm talking about the Bataclan Massacre and the Manchester Arena bombing. This is episode 24 of Uncharted: Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Boy, do I have some stories of terrorism for you.
Mon paradis c'est Paris, même quand il est gris.
The Bataclan Theatre opened in the 11th arrondissement of Paris in 1865. Its name comes from an operetta entitled Bataclan, which was a very big hit in its day. The title of that musical production was a play on the phrase Toute la Bataclan, which roughly translates as the whole 9 yards. For decades, the Bataclan attracted crowds to 50 Boulevard Voltaire to see concerts and vaudeville performances. Then it became a movie theater, then an exhibition hall. And since the 1970s, the Bataclan has been used for concerts. The Velvet Underground, Genesis, Prince, Kraftwerk, Fish, The Killers, 30 Seconds to Mars, David Byrne, and hundreds of other acts have appeared on its stage. Jeff Buckley made a live album there. On Friday, November 13th, 2015, Eagles of Death Metal were set to headline a gig. A group from Austria called the White Miles were the openers. And it was supposed to be just another Friday night out in Paris. It was a balmy night, too, with many people out on the streets and sitting on cafe patios. However, the country was tense. In January, there were some attacks carried out by militants associated with Al-Qaeda. In February, 3 soldiers who were guarding a Jewish community center were stabbed. There was an attempt to blow up a factory near Lyon. August saw people shot and stabbed on a passenger train. The gunman said he was out to avenge deaths in Syria. ISIS was also very active. They claimed responsibility for the bombing of a Russian jetliner in October, and there were more suicide bombings in Beirut. There were also concerns that a big international climate convention scheduled for December could be a terrorist target. French authorities have long had to deal with terrorism and received intel and tips every single day. In the fall of 2015, they heard from agencies in both Turkey and Iraq that some kind of big attack was imminent, but those warnings were buried in all the other warnings that came in every day. What everyone missed was a well-planned, highly coordinated series of attacks taking place at 6 different locations at more or less the same time by 3 groups. The first attacks started at the Stade de France in the northern suburb of Saint-Denis. The French national team was playing an exhibition game against Germany. The plan seemed to be this: one or more of the men would get into the stadium and blow themselves up. In the panic to get out, everyone would stampede for the exits, where they would find more suicide bombers who would blow themselves up along with everyone in the blast radius. The match had been underway for about 20 minutes when a group of suicide bombers turned up at the gate. None of them had tickets, so they weren't let in. They tried several times at different gates but were refused entry each time. And this is when the carnage began. At around 9:16 p.m., one of the bombers was patted down by a security guard. His explosive vest was found, so he set it off, killing himself and an innocent person nearby. 3 minutes later, at 9:19, another bomber blew himself outside another gate. Since the game was being televised, people at home could hear the blasts. "23 minutes after that, this is 9:53 p.m., there was another explosion near the stadium at a McDonald's. The death toll was 4, 3 suicide bombers and 1 innocent bystander. French President François Hollande, who was at the game, was safely evacuated at halftime. The game continued without any announcement to avoid panic, but at the end of the match, everyone was able to leave except the German team, who learned that there had been a bomb threat against their hotel. So they spent the night on makeshift mattresses at the stadium with the French team, who stayed with them as a show of solidarity. The attack on the Stade de France was just the beginning. At 9:25, another group, 3 armed men, emerged from a black rental car on Rue Bichat in the 10th arrondissement. They shot the driver in the car in front of them and then started firing at people sitting on the terrace of a cafe called Le Carillon. They crossed the street and began shooting at people inside a restaurant called Le Petit Cambodge. Before they jumped back into the rental car, 13 people were dead and 10 others were seriously injured. The men then drove a few blocks to a couple of other restaurants on Rue de la Fontaine du Roi. It was now 9:32 p.m. People died inside Café Bon Bière and an Italian place called La Casa Nostra. 5 other people were killed and 8 were injured. The gunman again left in their rental car. The next stop was at 9:36 p.m. They drove to the Rue de Chardon in the 11th arrondissement, where they shot up a restaurant called La Belle Équipe. 21 people died, and 7 were left fighting for their lives. Finally, one of the men, a Belgian-Moroccan named Brahim Abdeslam, was dropped off at a place called Le Comptoir Voltaire. He went inside, sat down, ordered something from the waiter, apologized to everyone for interrupting their dinner, and then at 9:40 p.m., blew himself up. 15 people were injured. That rental car crew was responsible for at least 40 deaths and scores of injuries, all in the time span of 15 minutes. At the exact moment Abdeslam blew himself up in that restaurant, 3 men entered the Bataclan Theater. And this is a good time to answer the question, why the Bataclan? Its targeting apparently had something to do with the venue's owners. For 40 years, the Bataclan had been owned by a couple of brothers, Pascal and Joel Lalou. They were Jewish and often rented the theater to groups hosting pro-Israel events. The brothers had been threatened many times by anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish groups. On this night in November, White Miles, the opening act, had finished their gig. Eagles of Death Metal had started their set in front of about 1,500 people. When the music started that evening, no one knew about the black rental car that had been parked outside for over an hour. No one seemed to notice the 3 men inside. They were all French natives of Algerian descent. Fouad Mohammed Agad was 23. Sami Amamor was 28. And Ismail Omar Mostafi was 29. They were all heavily armed with automatic weapons and wearing suicide vests. At 9:40, they got out of the car and started shooting. 3 people died outside the Bataclan. Then they stormed into the theater. Eagles of Death Metal was into their 3rd song of the night. It was called Kiss the Devil. There was confusion at first. This had to be pyro, part of the show, right? The band thought that the sound system was malfunctioning. Well, no. Instead, rows and rows of people were cut down by gunfire. Hundreds of people were on the floor, some dead, some injured, some hiding. The gunmen also fired up into the balconies, and bodies fell to the main floor. The gunmen paused to reload 3 or 4 times and started shooting again. During those pauses, people ran for the exits. Many were shot in the back as the gunmen laughed. Those who made it to the emergency exit were shot by one of the terrorists waiting for them. The 2 others walked among the bodies on the floor, kicking them. If someone moved, they were shot in the head. The gunmen yelled that this was in retaliation for all the harm caused to Muslims by France. Others did manage to escape. Refuge was found in some rooms backstage. That's where the band found shelter. Upstairs, someone smashed a hole in the ceiling of a bathroom, and many hid in the rafters. 2 of the terrorists, Mohammed Agar and Mustafi, went up to the balconies to hunt for more victims. Amamor stayed on the main level, shooting anyone who tried to escape. The attack was now 20 minutes old. At 10 o'clock, Mohammed Agar and Mustafi found about 20 people hiding upstairs. They were all herded into a room, had their phones confiscated, and were forced to act as lookouts while also being used as human shields. 2 policemen arrived at 10:15. They found Amamor on stage and shot him dead, but at the same time he was also able to detonate his suicide vest. Mohammed Agar and Mustafi began firing on the cops, forcing them to withdraw. They had to wait for backup. At 10:30 p.m., about 40 minutes after the shooting started, an elite tactical squad arrived. They broke into 2 teams. The first evacuated survivors from the main floor. The others went upstairs to find the hostages. Using one of the hostages' phones, Mohammed Agar and Mustafi went back and forth with a police negotiator. Their demands were that unless France signed a binding document that ensured that France's forces were withdrawn from Muslim lands, they would start executing people. At 20 minutes after midnight, the SWAT team believed that the executions had begun. They decided to storm that upstairs room. They burst through the door using shields, grabbing hostages one by one and giving them cover. One of the terrorists, and we're not sure who, detonated his suicide vest. The other was shot before he could do the same. By 12:58 a.m., it was all over. 90 people died, most during the first 20 minutes of the attack. Hundreds had been wounded. All the hostages in the upstairs room were rescued safely. It took 10 hours to remove all the bodies, and a lot longer to identify everyone because some had left their IDs in their jackets, which they had left in the cloakroom. And now that it was over, people wanted answers. I'll tell you what was found next. The Bataclan Massacre, as it's become known, is one of the worst cases of terrorism and mass murder we've ever seen when it comes to a music event. And it took a while to unravel exactly what happened in Paris on the night of November 13th, 2015, when 130 people were killed and 416 injured, resulting from 3 separate attacks around the city. The vast majority, 106, were from France, but the dead also came from Algeria, Belgium, Egypt, Germany, Italy, the US, the UK, and 10 other countries. The dead at the Bataclan included a rock critic, an executive for Mercury Records, and the merch guy employed by Eagles of Death Metal. The PTSD was also intense. One man took his life 2 years later. Another survivor, a graphic novelist named Fred DeWild, committed suicide 9 years later. Members of the Deftones were at the show, although none of them were hurt. Frontman Chino Moreno was having dinner nearby when the attacks happened. The Deftones were scheduled to play the Bataclan the very next night. U2 was also on their way to Paris. They were scheduled to play 2 nights later, but those concerts were canceled for safety reasons. On Saturday, November 14th, members of U2 visited the Bataclan and added some flowers to the huge piles of wreaths outside the front door. 9 men were involved in these 3 attacks, 3 groups of 3. The first group went to the Stade de France, the second shot up all those restaurants and cafes, and the third went to the Bataclan. They were all outfitted with the same kind of firepower and suicide vests. 7 of the terrorists died during the attacks. 2 more were killed in a police raid 2 days later. There was also a 10th terrorist, a guy named Salah Abdeslam. He drove one group of men to the stadium and was supposed to set off his own suicide vest in another part of the city, but he never did because it apparently malfunctioned. Most of the terrorists were born in France or Belgium and were either of Algerian or Moroccan descent. 2 more were from Iraq. ISIS claimed responsibility, saying that they had organized the attacks from within France. They said this was in retaliation for all kinds of French behavior, from Paris being a center of perversion to foreign policy carried out against Muslim countries. Investigations pointed to Abdelhamid Aboud, a radical jihadist, as the ringleader. 2 of his brothers participated. He was killed in a police raid on November the 18th. Another jihadist, Abu Muhammad al-Adni, was killed in a missile attack in Syria on August 30th, 2016. The 3 cars used by the terrorists on November the 13th were all recovered. There were police raids across the country. 14 other men were arrested and charged. Another 6 were charged in absentia. 5 were either in Iraq or Syria, and 1 person was in Turkey. It was a complex investigation. A special courtroom with 12 overflow rooms needed to be constructed at the Palais de Justice in Paris, a building that dated to the 13th century. More than 300 lawyers were involved. More than 300 witnesses were lined up. 2 members of Eagles of Death Metal were called to testify. Proceedings began on September 8, 2021, so 5 years, 9 months, and 27 days after the attacks. The trial lasted 10 months. On June 29, 2022, the verdicts came down. All 20 men were convicted on charges of terrorism, aiding and abetting, fraud, creating false identities, plus providing transportation, guns, ammo, phones, and explosives. Salah Abdeslam, the 10th member of the November 13th crew and the only survivor of that night, was sentenced to life without parole. That's the most severe punishment under French law. It has only been laid 4 other times in modern French history. A film was made of the trial, but the court ordered that it not be released for 50 years. Strange, but no one will be able to see it until 2072. As an aside, an orthopedic surgeon was sued when he turned an X-ray taken of her survivor's arm, showing an AK-47 bullet still lodged, and turned it into an NFT and tried to sell it without talking to the woman. The French government also investigated the attacks in the form of several commissions and reviews. This led to the creation of a single national anti-terrorism agency. More than 80 preachers who espoused hate were expelled from the country. An ISIS command center in Syria was bombed by French planes. The public responded in an interesting way too. On a normal week, somewhere around 100 people applied to enlist in the French army. That rose to 1,500 a week following November 13, 2015. Meanwhile, the far right was given a boost, and immigration and migrants became even more of a talking point, not just in France, but across Europe. As for the Bataclan itself, the venue was closed. At first, the closure would be indefinite, but in February 2016, it was announced that it would reopen following a renovation. Sting was the first person to play the new Bataclan on November 12, 2016, 1 day before the first anniversary of the massacre. Concerts have continued ever since. But meanwhile, the lives of thousands of people have changed forever. Almost 18 months to the day after the Bataclan, another attack took place at a concert, this time at Manchester Arena. It was May 22, 2017. And once again, it was motivated by foreign forces intervening in Syria during that country's brutal civil war. 2 people were involved in this attack. Hashem Abedi was in charge of sourcing all the explosive materials. His older brother Salman carried out the attack. Both had seen action in the civil war in Libya. They were Libyan by ancestry, and their father was a jihadist fighter in Libya. Both had been in contact with agents of al-Qaeda, and both attended a mosque where the imam, another fighter from Libya, repeatedly called for violent jihad against the West. Both were called extremely religious by people who knew them. So, if this was about making a statement about American military forces, that was what they said, why carry out the bombing in Manchester, England? Well, England was easier to reach because both men were British citizens. And second, a friend of the brothers had been run over and stabbed to death by a Manchester gang in 2016. Planning began sometime in the spring of 2017. The target would be an Ariana Grande show at the Manchester Arena. A bomb would be set off outside the main exit of the venue as people were leaving. Salman Abedi, the bomber, made several trips, including to Libya, where he may have been trained by ISIS bomb makers to construct a device using acetone and peroxide that would send out thousands of nails, nuts, and screws upon detonation. On May 18th, 4 days before the bombing, Salman returned from a trip to Turkey. For the next 3 days, he carried out reconnaissance on the arena. He checked out all the doors, idly talking to a security guard and watching how people lined up to get in and how they left. Each time, closed-circuit TV showed him talking on the phone to someone. After Hashem gathered all the necessary components of the bomb, Salman built it at his home. It consisted of an explosive charge of triacetone triperoxide, a favorite of terrorists worldwide. The charge was inside a lightweight container, concealed, we think, in a blue backpack. And it was powerful. The bomb weighed about 30 kilos. Experts later estimated that it was lethal to a radius of at least 20 meters. On Monday, May 22nd, fans descended on Manchester Arena and the concert started at 7:35 p.m. Between 8:30 and 8:50, Abedi was seen at a nearby transit station served by buses, trains, and trams. At 8:36 p.m., he entered the men's restroom, leaving at 8:48. Abedi was captured on several CCTV cameras and seen by a number of people, including a couple of British transport police officers. At 9 o'clock, Ariana Grande started her set in front of just over 14,000 people. At around 9:13, Abedi disappeared, hiding in a place in the train station that was not covered by cameras. By 9:33, he was in an area of the station called the City Room, which is one of 4 entrances and exits to the arena. His reconnaissance told them that this was outside the security perimeter for concerts. No bag searches in the City Room. He was spotted several more times. At 10:12 p.m., a member of the public asked Abedi what he had in his blue backpack, thinking maybe he had a bomb. When Abedi didn't answer, that person reported his suspicions to the police at the station. Their response? Yeah, we already know about that guy. Someone else reported concerns about Abedi to an employee at the station, but that person was afraid he'd be branded as a racist if he asked a Middle Eastern man if he had a bomb in his backpack. He tried to radio other security people in the area, but there was too much radio traffic and he wasn't heard. The concert wrapped up at 10:30 p.m. At 10:31, just as people were streaming out of the show into the City Room, which remember is one of the 4 major exits from the arena, and as parents waited for their kids to come out, the bomb went off. 22 people were killed almost instantly. Abedi died of the blast. 10 people were under the age of 20, the youngest being an 8-year-old girl. One man was hit so hard by the blast that he could only be identified by the tattoo on his leg. It took many, many months to determine how many people were injured, but the number settled on a staggering 1,017. At least 79 were children. Police instantly realized that this was a bomb. Emergency calls started coming in, and within 1 minute, 10:32 p.m., first responders started arriving to look after the dead, the dying, the injured, and the traumatized. The first paramedics arrived at 10:53. Strangely, though, there was never more than 3 paramedics on site all night. Everyone concentrated on getting victims evacuated into a hospital. At 11:47, a police dog named Mojo was brought in to sniff out any other explosive devices, but there were none. At 11:52, the last of the injured were taken out of the city room. The Manchester bombing was one of the worst examples of terrorism on British soil, and the fallout was far-reaching. More on that in a moment. Just like we saw with the attacks on Paris in November 2015, there was immediate action by police and the military following the Manchester bombing on May 22, 2017. About 1,400 personnel were dispatched to sensitive areas across the country, including Buckingham Palace, Westminster, and even a few nuclear power stations. No one had any idea who was behind the bombing. Was it a one-off thing, or was it part of a coordinated operation like we saw in Paris? Things began with a raid of the Abedzi home. Others were taken into custody, 22 in all, but it was quickly determined that other than his brother finding him some bomb parts, Salam operated entirely on his own. The state of emergency continued across the UK for more than a week. Widespread condemnation came in from all over the world, except from ISIS, of course, which claimed responsibility. A years-long inquiry began. We learned that Abedzi had been flagged as a possible radical, but the only time he showed up on anyone's radar was for some petty crimes. Given that he drank and smoked weed, he didn't exactly fit the profile of a jihadist. Where did the money from the plot come from? Salman financed everything with student loans. The money was supposed to go to his business administration studies, but instead it went to trips to Libya to learn how to make bombs. MI5, Britain's domestic counterintelligence service, did admit that it had moved too slowly in following up on young men who could be radicalized. We heard that Salman had been reported for extremist views by 5 members of the local community and by several family members. Hashem, the brother, was arrested in Libya the day after the bombing. He was extradited and charged with murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to cause an explosion. He was found guilty of 22 charges of murder for helping his brother. He was sentenced to 55 years in jail. Had he been over 21 at the time of the bombing, he would have received the ultra-rare British sentence of life without parole. What about the public fallout? Ariana Grande canceled the rest of her tour and returned home suffering from PTSD. The citizens of Manchester banded together, creating an organization called One Love Manchester Emergency Fund. Grande returned to the city for a benefit concert on June the 4th. That event featured Take That, Miley Cyrus, Niall Horan from One Direction, Usher, and Pharrell Williams. Liam Gallagher made a surprise appearance, too. More than $13 million was raised. Manchester Arena was closed until September 9, 2017. The first post-gig bombing featured a benefit with Noel Gallagher and a few other acts from the area, Rick Astley, Courtneyers, and Blossoms. In December 2022, new legislation called Martin's Law, named after the victim, who was only identified by his leg tattoo, went into effect. It covers new security requirements for venues. There is also a memorial to the victims near Manchester City Centre. It's called the Glade of Life. Although the city has done its best to heal and move on, there are still some idiots prolonging the pain. In February 2022, a 24-year-old man vandalized the memorial, causing £10,000 in damage. He was arrested, charged, and convicted. And then there's the incredible situation, which is shades of the mass shooting in Sandy Hook. A conspiracy theorist named Richard Hall, a guy who calls himself a fully independent investigative journalist, claimed that the whole bombing was faked by government agencies. All the people involved were crisis actors. Hall put out several videos and wrote a book entitled The Night of the Bang, claiming that the terrorist bombing was a complete hoax. No one was actually killed or injured, he says. There was no bomb in that room or genuinely injured people. The primary evidence shows that there was no bomb in that room that exploded. Millions of people have bought a lie. His evidence was a video purportedly taken a few minutes after the explosion. No shrapnel or injuries are visible, Hall says. The number of people in the room seemed to be far lower than officially claimed, and that there was no sign of people rushing to attend to the dead or injured. Hall specifically went after a man named Martin Hibbert. He and his daughter were standing very close to Salman Abedzi when the bomb went off. Martin suffered severe spinal injuries. He's now confined to a wheelchair. His daughter ended up with brain damage. But Hall claims that this is all fake, saying that Eve was disabled before the bombing. I quote from him. Her parents are invoking their daughter's catastrophic disability as part of a huge fraud in the general public. He even went so far as to secretly film Eve and her mother to gather evidence. The Hibbards sued. At the first hearing, Hall claimed that there was no first-hand tangible evidence, like CCTV camera footage or photos, that showed that Martin and Eve were even there that night. What's more, other survivors lied about their injuries and that everyone, and this is a quote, agreed to take part in an exercise. Hall's lawyer says that however unpleasant his views on the matter are protected by freedom of expression laws. The Manchester concert bombing and the Bataclan Massacre are just two examples of live music being assaulted by terrorism. There's the mass shooting at the Harvest Festival in Las Vegas, for example. There have been at least 2 such incidents in Iraq. There was a gruesome event in Moscow, and we will cover those on a future episode. I want to leave you with this, though. Shortly after the bombing, a crowd gathered near Manchester Arena. There was a minute of silence, and then someone started to sing.
Stand out beside the fireplace, take that look from off your face. You ain't ever gonna burn my heart out. Sally can wait, she knows it's too late as we're walking on by. Soul slides away. He knows it's too late as they're walking on by. Soul slides away. Don't look back in anger, I heard you say.
You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can meet up on all the social media sites along with my website, which is a journalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every single day. Plus, there's the daily free newsletter that you should probably get. And check out my other podcast too, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes of that you can enjoy for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.